My father abandoned me on a Tuesday morning when I was 5 years old, and now 19 years, 8 successful patents, and one multimillion-dollar company later, he wants to reconnect. This is a wild one, so buckle up and get ready, and also subscribe if you enjoy stories like these. The irony isn't lost on me. The man who didn't stick around to see if I'd survive my childhood now wants VIP access to my adulthood. The man whose departure sent my mother to an early grave now sends me a handwritten letter claiming blood is thicker than water. The man who let me rot in an orphanage for 13 years now wants to celebrate my success as if he had any part in creating it. He discarded me like garbage, and now that I've turned myself into gold, he's developed a sudden interest in recycling. They say you can't miss what you never had, but that's bullshit. I missed having a father every single day, at school events where other kids had 2 parents cheering, at graduation when I walked across the stage to silence, during nightmares at the orphanage when I had no one to run to. The absence of something can be just as defining as its presence. I learned that at 5 years old, watching my father's car disappear down our street, his brake lights the last thing I'd see of him for nearly 2 decades. My mother died 53 days later. Heart attack, they said. Medical terminology for a broken heart. I remember the social worker explaining that I was going to a special place where other children without parents lived. She used words like temporary and placement, but children understand more than adults think. I knew even then that my life had fractured irreparably. The orphanage stood on the outskirts of town, a Victorian monstrosity that loomed against the sky like a bad omen. The building itself seemed to exhale misery, breath condensing into the musty scent that permeated everything: bedsheets, clothing, skin. It wasn't the kind of place where childhood thrived. It was where childhood went to die by slow suffocation. The headmistress ran the place with military precision and casual cruelty. She was a tall woman with hands like steel traps and a voice that could freeze running water. "Children need discipline," she would say, usually right before administering it with a wooden ruler or a leather belt, depending on her mood or the severity of the perceived offense. I learned quickly to become invisible. The quiet kids, the ones who didn't cause trouble, sometimes escaped notice. But not always. Sometimes being invisible made you a target for the older boys who prowled the halls like prison yard predators, or for staff members who needed someone to blame when things went missing or broke. My first beating came 3 weeks after arrival. I'd wet the bed, a common enough reaction for a 5-year-old who just lost everything. The headmistress made me strip the sheets in front of everyone at breakfast, then stand in the corner holding them while the ammonia smell announced my shame to the entire dining hall. That night, 2 older boys cornered me in the bathroom, held my head in a toilet, and took turns flushing. "Just helping you get used to water," they laughed. I don't know which was worse, the physical pain or the humiliation. Both taught me something essential about surviving that place. Pain ends eventually, but shame burrows deep if you let it. I decided then I wouldn't let it. Instead, I retreated into books and dreams. The orphanage had a small library, donations mostly, outdated encyclopedias, and tattered paperbacks. I read everything indiscriminately. Science fiction showed me worlds beyond my current reality. History taught me that suffering was universal but not eternal. Mathematics offered the comfort of problems with definitive solutions. By 10, I was doing high school level work. By 13, I was building crude computers from parts I'd scavenged from the orphanage's single ancient desktop and components donated by a local electronics store owner who took pity on the quiet, intense kid who kept asking technical questions. My 6th grade teacher was the first adult since my mother who seemed to see me, really see me. Not as an orphan or a problem or a case number, but as a person with potential. She fought to get me into advanced classes, brought me extra books, stayed after school to guide me through concepts beyond the standard curriculum. "Intelligence without opportunity is like a seed in concrete," she told me once. "My job is to crack that concrete, but you're the one who has to grow." And grow I did, though not without setbacks. For every teacher like her, there were 3 like the history teacher who caught me reading physics textbooks during his class and ripped them up in front of everyone, saying, "Orphans don't become scientists. They become janitors if they're lucky." I kept the torn pages. They're framed on the wall of my home office now, next to my college diploma. The years at the orphanage taught me that the world isn't fair, that adults can't be trusted, and that survival sometimes requires becoming what others don't expect you to be. I became a chess player in a world of checkers enthusiasts, always thinking several moves ahead, anticipating obstacles, planning escapes. And all the while I wondered about him. The man who'd driven away. Did he ever think about the son he'd abandoned? Did he know my mother had died? Did he care? I had only fragments of memories, a deep laugh, the smell of motor oil and mint gum, strong hands tossing me into the air. Nothing substantial enough to build a father from. Yet his absence shaped me more definitively than his presence ever could have. My name is Nick, and this is the story of how I confronted the man who made me an orphan. The day I aged out of the orphanage was the first time I felt truly free. 18 years old with nothing but a trash bag containing my meager possessions, $200 saved from odd jobs, and acceptance letters to 3 universities with scholarships that would cover most, but not all, of my expenses. Freedom, I quickly learned, was both exhilarating and terrifying. I found a basement apartment near campus that smelled perpetually of mildew and the Indian food cooked by the family upstairs. The landlord took pity on me after I explained my situation and let me work as the building's unofficial maintenance man in exchange for reduced rent. Between that, a dishwashing job, a local diner, and weekend shifts stocking shelves at a hardware store, I managed to cover what my scholarships didn't. College was a revelation. For the first time, my intelligence was an asset rather than a liability. Professors encouraged questions. Other students sought me out for study groups. No one knew I was an orphan unless I told them, which I rarely did. I could reinvent myself, shed the skin of the unwanted child, and emerge as someone new, someone with a future. Computer engineering came naturally to me. Lines of code were predictable in a way humans never were. They did exactly what you told them to do. No more, no less. If there was a problem, you could troubleshoot it methodically until you found the error. Unlike people who buried their bugs so deep sometimes even they didn't know what was causing the malfunction. My breakthrough came during junior year. I'd been tinkering with an idea for a security protocol that could self-modify to respond to new threats, essentially teaching itself to recognize patterns that might indicate an intrusion attempt. One professor saw potential in it beyond what even I had imagined. "This isn't just clever coding, Nick," he said, peering at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. "This is potentially revolutionary. Have you considered patenting it?" I hadn't. Growing up in an orphanage doesn't exactly prepare you for navigating intellectual property law. But he connected me with a former student who worked at a patent law firm willing to take me on pro bono. 8 months later, I held my first patent certificate, my name in official print, declaring to the world that I had created something valuable, something worth protecting. That first patent led to a job offer before I'd even graduated. A mid-sized cybersecurity firm was looking to expand its personal security division. They gave me a corner cubicle, a decent salary, and creative freedom to develop my ideas. 2 years and 3 more patents later, I had enough leverage to negotiate a better position and an ownership stake in the specific products I developed. By 24, I had founded my own company. The name was deliberate, rising from the ashes of my past to create something that would protect others. We specialized in adaptive security systems for both digital and physical spaces. My orphanage-honed hypervigilance, it turned out, translated perfectly to anticipating security vulnerabilities. Success came faster than I expected. A major tech company integrated our protocols into their flagship products. Government contracts followed. Venture capitalists came knocking. Suddenly, I was not just financially secure, but wealthy. I bought a modernist house on the edge of the city with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in so much light, I sometimes had to wear sunglasses indoors, the exact opposite of the perpetually dim orphanage dormitories. Money, I discovered, was a curious thing. It couldn't erase the past, but it could ensure the future looked nothing like it. It couldn't buy happiness, but it removed many obstacles to finding it. It couldn't heal old wounds, but it could provide distractions from the pain. What it couldn't do was fill the void where family should have been. I dated casually but avoided commitment. Trust didn't come easily to me. The few times I tried to explain my background to women I was seeing, I could see the pity in their eyes, or worse, the fascination, as if I were some exotic specimen they wanted to study and fix. I preferred keeping people at a comfortable distance. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Plain white envelope, my name and address handwritten in blue ink, no return address. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail or a missed delivery. But something, intuition perhaps, or the ghost of that hypervigilance, made me open it. The paper inside was cheap, the kind you'd find in a drugstore notebook. The handwriting matched the envelope, slightly slanted to the right, pressing hard enough to leave indentations on the back of the page. "Nick, you don't know me, but I'm your father's sister, your aunt. I've been trying to find you for years, but the adoption records were sealed and the orphanage wouldn't release information. It was only when I saw your photo in a business magazine that I realized who you must be. You look so much like him. Your father has been asking about you. He's not well, heart problems, and I think he's trying to make peace with his past mistakes. I know he left when you were young. I know that's unforgivable. But he's still your father, and he's dying. If you want to meet him, he's at the regional hospital. Room 404. He might have a month left, maybe less. I understand if you don't want to see him, but I thought you deserved to know. Your aunt. I read the letter 7 times, until the words blurred together. Then I crumpled it into a ball, and threw it across the room. It bounced off the wall and rolled under my coffee table, where I left it for 3 days, pretending it didn't exist. On the 4th day, I retrieved it, smoothed it out, and read it again. Then I called my assistant and cleared my schedule for the following afternoon. I told myself I was going just to tell him off, to let him see what he'd missed, what he'd thrown away. I told myself this wasn't about closure or forgiveness or any of that therapeutic bullshit. This was about justice, my justice on my terms. I wore my most expensive suit, the one I reserved for board meetings and investor pitches. Armani, charcoal gray, tailored to my exact measurements. I added a watch that cost more than most people's cars and cufflinks that had once belonged to a tech mogul. If I was going to face the man who'd abandoned me, I wanted to look like everything he'd missed out on. The hospital was in an older part of the city, all brick and narrow windows. I parked my Tesla in the visitor lot and walked in through the main entrance, nodding to the receptionist as if I belonged there, as if I visited dying relatives every day. Room 404 was at the end of a long corridor that smelled of antiseptic and despair. I paused outside the door, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it was audible. For a moment, I considered turning around, going back to my carefully constructed life, where this man didn't exist. Instead, I knocked. A woman's voice called out, "Come in." I pushed open the door, stepping into a reality I'd spent 19 years trying to forget. The hospital room was standard issue, beige walls, linoleum floor, the rhythmic beeping of monitors providing a soundtrack to illness. A woman stood by the window, thin and gray-haired, but with a certain ramrod straightness to her spine that suggested resilience. My aunt, presumably. But it was the figure in the bed that captured my attention. I'd built up such an image of my father over the years, part monster, part myth, that the reality was jarringly mundane. He was just a man wasted by illness, tubes connecting him to machines that tracked his failing body's functions. His skin had a yellowish cast to it, stretched too tight over prominent cheekbones. His hair, what remained of it, was white. Yet I knew him instantly. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, I saw them every morning in my mirror. Biology is merciless that way. It binds you to people you might prefer to forget. Nick. The woman by the window turned, her face lighting with recognition. You came. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure why I did, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The man in the bed stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were blue, like mine, the same shade exactly. When they focused on me, I saw them widen in recognition. Is that? His voice was a rasp, barely audible. Yes, it's Nick, my aunt said, moving to his bedside. Your son. He stared at me for a long moment, then tears began leaking from the corners of his eyes. You're all grown up, he whispered. Something twisted in my chest, rage or grief or some bitter cocktail of both. That's what happens when you abandon a kid for 19 years, I said coldly. They grow up without you. My aunt flinched, but I didn't care. I hadn't come for her comfort or approval. I deserve that, my father said, surprising me. I'd expected denials, excuses, attempts to rewrite history. I deserve your anger. I earned it. I didn't come here for your confession, I said. I came to tell you that I made it. Despite you. Despite everything. I built something. I became someone. And I did it all without a single thing from you. He nodded weakly. I saw. In the magazines. You're successful. Brilliant. Your mother would be so proud. The mention of my mother was like a knife between my ribs. Don't talk about her. You don't get to say her name. Fair enough, he conceded. A coughing fit overtook him then, his body convulsing with the effort. My aunt reached for a plastic cup with a straw, helping him take small sips of water until the spasms subsided. When he could speak again, he gestured weakly to a chair beside the bed. Will you sit? Just for a minute. I remained standing, arms crossed over my expensive suit like armor. Say what you need to say. His eyes, my eyes, studied my face with a hunger that made me uncomfortable. How much do you remember? He asked. About what? About before, when we were a family. I shrugged. Not much. Fragments. Nothing substantial. He nodded as if this confirmed something. I thought as much. You were so young. He paused, gathering strength. Do you know why I left? Because you were a coward. I suggested, the words sharp as glass. Again, he surprised me by nodding. Yes, that's exactly right. I was a coward, but not in the way you think. Despite myself, curiosity flickered. What's that supposed to mean? He shifted in the bed, wincing at what appeared to be constant pain. Your mother and we weren't doing well. Financially, I had lost my job. We were behind on the mortgage. The credit cards were maxed out. He took a labored breath. There was an opportunity, a job overseas. Good money, enough to get us back on our feet. But it was dangerous work, in a dangerous place. So you took it and never came back, I concluded, unimpressed. Still sounds like abandonment to me. I took it, he agreed. I sent money home. Every month. For years. This was not the story I'd expected. What? My aunt stepped in. It's true, Nick. He sent checks. Your mother should have had enough. She died 53 days after he left, I said flatly. My father closed his eyes, pain crossing his features that had nothing to do with his physical condition. I didn't know. Not for almost a year. The checks kept being cashed. I assumed. Who was cashing them? I demanded. Your mother's brother, my aunt said quietly. Your uncle. He was supposed to be looking after you both. When your mother died, he should have contacted us, but he didn't. He just kept cashing the checks. And you never called. I directed this at my father, incredulous. Never wrote. Never came to visit. The job. He hesitated. I was working in a conflict zone. Communication was difficult, sometimes impossible. And yes, I was a coward. I told myself it was better this way, that I was providing for you both, that one day I'd come home with enough money to make everything right. His voice broke. By the time I found out your mother had died, and you'd been placed in an orphanage, you'd already been there for 11 months. I tried to find you to get custody, but there were complications. What complications? I wasn't buying this convenient narrative. My aunt exchanged a glance with my father. Your uncle, she said after a moment. He told the authorities that your father had abandoned you both, that he was unfit. There was an investigation. By the time it was resolved, you'd been in the system for over 2 years. The judge decided it would be traumatic to uproot you again. I laughed, the sound harsh in the sterile room. More traumatic than growing up in that hellhole? More traumatic than thinking my father didn't want me. I tried to visit, my father said. They wouldn't let me. Said it would confuse you, give you false hope. The court-appointed psychologist recommended clean breaks, either full reunion or nothing. He swallowed hard. I sent money to the orphanage instead. For your care. For your education. My mind was reeling. I never saw any of that money. We had nothing. Worn-out clothes, terrible food. I know, he interrupted. I found out years later. The director was embezzling funds, not just mine. He went to prison for it eventually. I felt like I'd walked into the middle of someone else's story. None of this aligned with the narrative I'd constructed over the years, the story that had both tormented and driven me. So you're saying it was all just unfortunate circumstances? I said, disbelief evident in my voice. A series of misunderstandings and bad luck? And I'm supposed to what? Forgive and forget? No, my father said, his voice suddenly stronger. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I made choices, bad ones. I prioritized money over presence. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by staying away, earning enough to secure your future. I told myself that was what a good father did. He coughed again, a rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within his failing body. I was wrong. A good father stays. A good father finds another way. I stood there, my carefully prepared speech in tatters, my righteousness feeling suddenly hollow. This was not the confrontation I had envisioned. Why now? I finally asked. Why reach out now? Because I'm dying, he said simply. And because you deserve to know the truth, even if it changes nothing. He hesitated, then added, and selfishly, because I wanted to see the man my son became. Just once. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with decades of absence and loss, with anger and regret too tangled to easily separate. After what felt like minutes, my aunt quietly excused herself, murmuring something about getting coffee. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. My father and I were alone, connected by blood, and separated by everything else. "I understand if you walk out that door and never come back," he said softly. "I've earned that. But if there's anything you want to know, anything at all, about your mother, about your family history, about medical issues you might need to be aware of, ask now. I don't have much time left to answer." I remained standing, my hands now deep in my pockets, my mind chaotic with competing emotions. I had come here for closure, for a chance to show this man what he had missed, what he had thrown away. I had come to reject any overture he might make, to deny him the peace of reconciliation. Instead, I found myself asking, what was she like? My mother, after you left, before she died. His face softened, a ghost of love passing over it. "She was brave," he said, "so much braver than me. She wrote me letters. I found them years later. They never reached me, where she talked about how you were growing, the new words you were learning, how you were already showing signs of being exceptional at puzzles and patterns." His eyes met mine, steady despite his weakness. "She loved you more than anything in this world, Nick. Her last letter, the one dated just a week before she died, she wrote about how you were the light of her life, how seeing you grow was her greatest joy." Something cracked inside me, a fissure in the protective shell I'd built around my heart. I sank into the chair beside the bed, suddenly unable to stand under the weight of this new history, this revised past that threatened the very foundation of who I'd become. "Did she know?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "That she was sick? That she was going to die?" He shook his head. "The doctor said it was sudden. A congenital heart defect that had gone undetected. She wouldn't have suffered long." Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. I had spent years imagining her final moments, wondering if she had been afraid, if she had worried what would become of me. "I have photos," my father said unexpectedly, "of all of us, from before, and some just of you and her after I left. My sister, your aunt, she saved them." He gestured weakly toward a worn leather satchel on the nearby table. "They're yours if you want them." I stared at the bag, torn between hunger for these tangible connections to my past and fear of what they might awaken. "I don't expect anything from you, Nick," my father continued softly. "I just wanted you to know that you were loved. You were always loved. My failure as a father wasn't because you weren't wanted or cherished. It was because I was weak and made the wrong choices over and over." The monitors beeped steadily, marking the passing seconds of this strange reunion. Outside the window, the city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the small drama playing out in this room, to the reconstruction of a personal history taking place between two men connected by blood and separated by time. I realized then that the story I had been telling myself, the one where I triumphed despite abandonment, where my success was the ultimate revenge against the father who didn't want me, was crumbling. Not because it wasn't partly true, but because it was incomplete. The narrative I'd built my identity around had too many missing pages, too many voices I'd never heard, including his. "Tell me about her," I said finally, surprising myself. "Tell me everything you remember." For the next hour, my father spoke. His voice grew weaker as time passed, but the memories seemed to energize him. He told me how my mother and he had met at a community college art class. She was talented, he was terrible, but took the class just to be near her. How she loved thunderstorms, but was terrified of heights. How she sang off-key, but with such joy that no one had the heart to tell her. How she had read to me every night from the day I was born, convinced it would make me brilliant. He spoke of family I had never known existed, grandparents long deceased, cousins scattered across the country, aunts and uncles who had lost track of me after my mother's death. He told me about hereditary traits that might explain some of my own peculiarities, a tendency toward insomnia that apparently ran through his side of the family, an unusual double-jointed thumb I had inherited from my mother's father. With each story, each forgotten detail of my origin, something shifted inside me. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that and might never be, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that I was not merely self-made, that I existed as part of a continuum, a story that had begun long before my conscious memory and would continue in ways I couldn't foresee. When my aunt returned, she brought more photographs, ones my father hadn't known existed. Pictures of my mother pregnant with me, her face radiant. My father assembling a crib, looking both terrified and proud. The three of us in a park, my parents' faces young and unmarked by the hardships to come. What happened to her brother? I asked suddenly. My uncle? The one who took the money. My aunt's face hardened. Prison eventually. Not for what he did to you. That was never provable, but for other frauds. He died there 10 years ago. I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret at this information. Just another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. As afternoon stretched into evening, my father's energy began to fade. His sentences grew shorter, punctuated by longer pauses. The nurse came in to check his vital signs and gave me a look that suggested our time might be limited. I should go, I said, standing. You need to rest. Will you? He stopped, closed his eyes briefly. Will you come back? Before. The question hung between us, weighted with far more than its simple words. Would I come back? Would I allow this fragile connection, this tentative bridge across 19 years of absence, to solidify into something that might resemble reconciliation? Would I grant him, and perhaps myself, that peace before the end? I don't know, I answered honestly. I need to think. He nodded, accepting this as fair. The photographs, he reminded me, gesturing weakly toward the satchel. Take them. They're yours regardless. I picked up the bag, feeling its weight, the physical weight of paper and ink, but also the metaphorical weight of heritage and memory. Thank you, I said, the words inadequate but necessary. Nick, he called as I reached the door. I turned back. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm proud of you. So proud. Not because of your success, though that's remarkable, but because of who you are, your resilience, your strength. You survived everything, including my absence, and became extraordinary. His voice broke. I just wanted you to know that. I stood frozen, one hand on the door handle. 1,000 responses rose to my lips. Angry rejections, cold dismissals, the rehearsed speech I'd prepared for this moment that now felt hollow and performative. In the end, what came out was simple truth. I needed to hear that, I said quietly. 19 years ago. His eyes filled with tears. I know. I left then, walking down the antiseptic corridor with its 2 bright lights, past nurses and doctors and visitors whose lives were intersecting with this place of transition, of healing or dying or somewhere in between. My aunt followed me to the elevator, touching my arm gently before I could enter. He might not have much time left, she said. Days, maybe? The doctors aren't sure. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Will you come back? She asked, echoing my father's question. I looked at her, this stranger who was my blood, this woman who had reached across time and distance to find me, to offer me a connection to a past I'd thought lost forever. I don't know, I repeated, but you have my number now. If, when the time comes, call me. She squeezed my arm, understanding what I wasn't saying. Outside, the evening had turned cool, a light rain falling. I sat in my car for a long time, the leather satchel on the passenger seat beside me, unopened. Finally, I reached over and unbuckled it, pulling out the stack of photographs. My mother's face looked up at me from the top one, young, laughing, her arms around a toddler version of myself. I traced her features with a fingertip, searching for memories that had faded to near nothing over the years. There was something both familiar and foreign about her smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the tilt of her head. It was like looking at a ghost, not frightening, but wistful, a glimpse of what might have been. The next photo showed all 3 of us. My father, young, strong, with a full head of dark hair, stood with his arm around my mother. I was between them, maybe 3 years old, gripping each of their hands. We looked happy, normal. A family. It was disorienting, seeing evidence of this alternate reality. In my mind, there had never been a before, only the orphanage, the struggle, the loneliness. These images suggested a different origin story, one where I had been wanted, cherished, part of something whole. I flipped through more photos, watching myself grow from infant to toddler to the small boy I'd been when my father left. In the later pictures, he was absent, but my mother's smile remained, though it seemed more fragile, more forced. The last few photos showed her looking thinner, tired, her complexion slightly gray even in the faded color prints. Signs of the heart condition that would take her, perhaps visible only in retrospect. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, reminding me about a meeting early the next morning. The real world intruding. I set the photos aside and started the car, but instead of driving home, I found myself heading toward the old neighborhood, the one I barely remembered from before the orphanage. The street looked different than the few hazy memories I'd retained. The houses were smaller than I recalled, the trees taller. I drove slowly, searching for something familiar, some landmark that might trigger recognition. Halfway down the block, I stopped in front of a modest bungalow with blue trim. Something about it tugged at me, the shape of the front porch, perhaps, or the large oak tree in the yard. I couldn't be certain this was the house where we'd lived, but felt right somehow. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, rain pattering on the roof, trying to reconcile the competing narratives of my life. The abandoned orphan, the cherished son, the self-made success, the product of love and loss and circumstance. The truth, I was beginning to realize, was that I was all of these things. My father's failures and my mother's love, the orphanage's cruelty and my teacher's encouragement, my own determination and the random luck of being born with a brain that could solve certain kinds of problems. All of it had shaped me, created me, brought me to this moment. I had come to the hospital that day to reject my father, to deny him the reconciliation he sought, to tell him that I had succeeded without him, that he had no place in my life. I had wanted to hurt him as he had hurt me, to make him feel the weight of all he'd missed, all he'd thrown away. Instead, I found myself questioning the very foundation of my identity. If I wasn't just the abandoned orphan who had risen from nothing through sheer force of will, then who was I? If my success wasn't purely a triumph over adversity, if there had been love at my beginning, if my father had tried in his flawed way to provide for me, what did that mean for the story I'd been telling myself for 20 years? My phone buzzed again. My aunt this time, a text message. He's asking for you. The doctors say it might be tonight. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to turn off the phone, to drive away from this complicated reality, back to the cleaner narrative I'd constructed, to let him die without the absolution he sought. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime wondering, imagining, yearning for connection even as I pushed people away, that part knew I would go back. Not for him, not really, but for myself. For the boy who had lain awake in the orphanage dormitory, wondering why he hadn't been loved enough to keep. I typed a simple reply, I'm coming. The hospital corridor seemed longer this time, the fluorescent lights harsher. Outside my father's room, I paused, gathering myself. Through the partially open door, I could hear the labored sound of his breathing, the steady beep of monitors. My aunt saw me first, her face lighting with a mix of surprise and relief. Nick, she said softly, you came back. I nodded, moving into the room. My father lay still, eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He looked diminished somehow, as if he'd shrunk in the hours since I'd left. Can he hear me? I asked quietly. The doctors think so, she replied. He's been drifting in and out. But he asked for you the last time he was lucid. I approached the bed, oddly nervous. What did one say to a dying man? Especially this man who had been both cornerstone and gaping absence in my life. I'm here, I said simply, my voice steadier than I felt. His eyes flickered open, focusing slowly. When he saw me, a faint smile tugged at his lips. Nick, he whispered. You came. I came, I agreed, pulling the chair closer to the bed. The pictures, he asked, his voice barely audible. I have them, I said. Thank you for keeping them. He made a small movement with his hand, reaching weakly toward me. After a moment's hesitation, I took it, surprised by how light it felt, how fragile the bones beneath the papery skin. I'm sorry, he said, each word an effort. So sorry. For everything. I swallowed hard, emotions warring within me. I know, I said finally. I believe you. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was acceptance of his remorse, of the truth of our complicated history, of the fact that life rarely offers the clean narratives we crave. You were loved, he insisted, his grip on my hand tightening fractionally. Always. By both of us. I know that now, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. The photos had shown me that much, at least. Whatever came after, whatever mistakes were made, I had started life surrounded by love. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds a steady beep of monitors and the rasp of his breathing. Outside the window, night had fallen completely, the city lights glimmering through the rain-streaked glass. I built a security system, I found myself saying. For my company. It adapts, learns from patterns, predicts threats before they materialize. I paused, not sure why I was telling him this. People say it's revolutionary. His eyes, dulled by pain and medication, brightened slightly. Tell me, he whispered. So I did. I told him about the algorithms, the learning matrices, the way the system could anticipate vulnerabilities before they were exploited. I spoke of the applications, the potential, the future directions. I talked about my work, my passion, the things that drove me. He listened, focused despite his obvious pain, asking occasional questions that surprised me with their insight. Once an engineer himself, my aunt had told me. I could see it now, in the way he understood the concepts, the way his mind worked even as his body failed. When I ran out of technical details, I found myself talking about other things. My apartment with its view of the city. My favorite coffee shop where I did my best thinking. The stray cat I'd been feeding that had recently decided to move in permanently. Small things, ordinary things. The stuff of a life. My life. As I spoke, I realized I was giving him a gift, glimpses of the person I'd become, the day-to-day existence he would never be part of. And in doing so, I was giving myself something too. The chance to be known, to be witnessed, by the man whose absence had shaped so much of who I was. His breathing grew more labored as the night wore on. The nurses came and went, adjusting machines, checking vital signs, their faces professionally compassionate. My aunt dozed in a chair by the window, exhausted by the vigil. Around 3 a.m, my father's eyes opened with sudden clarity. "Nick," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You're going to be all right." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I am." He nodded, satisfied. "Good." His eyes drifted closed again, his breathing slowing. I sat beside him, still holding his hand, feeling the tenuous connection between us, biological, emotional, complicated. Not what I'd expected or thought I wanted, but real nonetheless. He died as dawn was breaking, slipping away so quietly I wasn't immediately sure he was gone. One moment he was breathing, the next he wasn't. The monitors registered the change, alerting the nurses who came quickly, efficiently, to confirm what we already knew. My aunt wept silently, her shoulders shaking. I sat numbly, still holding my father's hand, feeling strangely empty. Not relieved, not devastated, just hollow. As if I'd been emptied out, and not yet refilled. Later, after the necessary paperwork and arrangements, I drove my aunt back to her hotel. We sat in the car for a moment, two strangers connected by a man who was now gone. "Will you stay?" she asked. "For the funeral?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. My first instinct was to say no, to retreat back to my ordered life, to process this strange experience alone. But something stopped me. "Yes," I said. "I'll stay." She nodded, clearly relieved. "There's more," she said hesitantly. "More family. Your cousins, your grandmother, your father's mother. She's in a nursing home now, but her mind is still sharp. They'd all like to meet you if you're willing." I thought about the photographs, about the glimpses they'd given me of a past I'd thought lost, about the possibility of connections I'd never imagined having. "Maybe," I said. "Not all at once, but maybe." She seemed to understand that this was as much as I could offer right now. "One step at a time," she agreed. As I drove home through the early morning light, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, exactly. The wounds were too deep, too old for that. But perhaps a realignment, a reframing of the story I'd been telling myself for so long. I was still the orphan who had risen from nothing, who had built a successful life through determination and intelligence. But I was also the son of a woman who had loved me dearly, and of a man who had failed me, but who had in his own flawed way tried to make amends. I was the product of both absence and presence, of abandonment and love, of struggle and unexpected grace. My past hadn't changed, but my understanding of it had. And perhaps that was enough for now. When I arrived home, I took the satchel of photographs and placed them carefully on my desk. Tomorrow, I would find a proper album for them, a way to preserve these tangible links to a history I was only beginning to reclaim. But for now, I was exhausted. I kicked off my shoes and lay down on my bed, fully clothed, watching the early morning light filter through the blinds. I thought about my father, about the orphanage, about the long journey that had brought me here, about the story I'd been telling myself and the new one I might begin to write. I didn't need my father. I'd proven that much, at least. But perhaps I needed to know him, to understand the full truth of where I'd come from, in order to fully inhabit who I'd become. As I drifted towards sleep, I felt a curious sense of lightness. Not freedom, exactly, and certainly not closure, that neat psychological concept that rarely exists in real life. But something like peace, or at least the beginning of it. The recognition that my story was both simpler and more complex than I'd believed, both darker and lighter, both mine alone, and part of something larger. My father had made me an orphan. But before that, he had made me a son. Both were true. Both were part of me. And somehow, knowing that made all the difference. Thanks for listening to the entire story if you enjoyed it or not. Please subscribe and like the video, this helps a lot.